Hey guys, I'm Evan Thorpe. This is Michelle Martinelli, and this is For the Win's weekly college football breakdowns. And Michelle, we had upsets this week. We had some big games. And before I get to talking, I just want to know, what was the biggest upset to you this weekend?
I think hands down LSU over Georgia,
yes.
right?
Yes.
You and I, for the last couple weeks, have had Georgia as the second team to represent the SEC in the college football playoff, along with Alabama. Now all of a sudden it looks like there's probably not going to be two SEC teams in the playoff now that Georgia has a loss. And what's interesting here about this is that LSU, who lost to Florida a couple weeks ago, didn't just beat Georgia, they destroyed them. Yeah. And that's, makes us question, is maybe Georgia not as good as we thought? Are we underestimating LSU? That just has major playoff implications going forward, because it essentially freed up a spot in the 4-team playoff that we assumed would go to a second SEC team, and now there's just a few more question marks there.
Some other big upsets we had: Michigan State over Penn State. Big Big Ten implications with that game. You had Oregon beat Washington, and we'll be talking about Oregon later on in the show. And lastly, we had Iowa State beating West Virginia. And for Will Grier, do you think he's in that Heisman conversation anymore?
I think he's sort of dropped down a little bit now. I think, especially with a team that has that loss and they're struggling a little bit now, I just don't know that he's going to be able to keep up with Heisman frontrunner, Alabama quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, or Ohio State quarterback Dwayne Haskins. Those two are kind of just running away with it.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of these Heisman frontrunners. Like you said, Tua, Dwayne Haskins. What can Dwayne Haskins do to get his name up there with Tua? Because so far this year, Tua is running away with it. It looks like this is his award to win.
It definitely is. And I think that he is getting a bit more favoritism here because Alabama's offense as a whole, and obviously the team as a whole, is blowing everybody out of the water. Whereas even though Ohio State beat TCU, they struggled a little bit. Even though they beat Penn State, they struggled a little bit. Even last week against Minnesota, it took them a second to get going, and so they struggled a little bit. Whereas with Alabama, they're still beating all their teams by double-digit numbers, and I think that's giving Tua an extra little boost in that conversation. But that's not to say it's not deserving. His completion percentage is higher than 70%. He has thrown 0 interceptions, which I think is a big thing out there. But Dwayne Haskins is putting up similar numbers, and so I don't necessarily want to give it to Tua right away, like it's a foregone conclusion.
Michelle, I think I got to add somebody in here. A defensive player who's not getting enough recognition, Ed Oliver. I think if it's going to be a defensive guy that represents, the big guys on the teams, it's got to be Ed Oliver. With Bosa being out for Ohio State, I think he may be the only defensive player to get some type of recognition. I think he could possibly replace Murray and be in the top 3, but it's going to be hard because you have some talented offensive weapons. But let's go into some of the big surprises halfway through the season so far. And normally we would say Alabama's been dominant on defense, no team is scoring them, but it's reversed almost, is where their offense is so dominant this year. Why is that such a surprise for us?
It's not even that their offense is so dominant, it's also that their passing game in particular. Usually teams, especially SEC teams, sit there and focus on how are you going to stop Alabama on the ground, and now all of a sudden, with 2 quarterbacks in the mix, they're beating you in the air, they're beating you on the ground, and I just think that their level of dominance is so exceptional compared to everyone else. They're blowing teams out of the water. Even for a second there this weekend against Mizzou, it was a close game for a couple minutes, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, is this going to be the team to take down the Giants? And then they don't, and Alabama runs away with it. So I think just the level of dominance is surprising. Not that Alabama's winning, but it's the way in which they're winning.
Last up, Michelle, I think this is a personal one for me. A team that went 13-0 last season. They are 6-0 right now, and they were the national champions if you asked them last year. UCF is not respected by voters, and why aren't they one of the teams that people say, hey, this team could get in, or, this team is having a great year?
I mean, there's no doubt they're having a great year, right? And everything we talk about in this conversation is not to discount how challenging it is to have a 19-game winning streak. Like, that is exceptional. And no one else in college football is doing anything like that. The problem is, even though they held on to that win streak, sneaking away with a win on Saturday against Memphis, the problem is their schedule just isn't strong enough. They can't help what conference they're in and what teams they're going to have to play no matter what. But until they start scheduling some tough non-conference opponents, like someone from the Big Ten or maybe someone from the ACC, like why not throw in Miami in there or something like that?
Maybe a matchup with Florida, something like that.
Something like that. It's going to be really hard to take them seriously in terms of a playoff spot, even though they're undefeated. And that's, again, I think that's a huge surprise that they are still undefeated at this point. But they're not, I don't think they're going to have a realistic shot at the playoff until they amp up their schedule a little bit. And we're going to be having the same conversation that we had last year going into the playoffs. Does UCF deserve to be in there or not? And until they get a little more meat on their schedule, the answer is probably no.
All right, let's look at some games this week. Clemson, NC State. And, you know, we had Clemson out of the college football playoffs. We thought the ACC was weak. And
I still think the ACC is weak.
Now, because, you know, a lot of teams are with one loss, an undefeated Clemson team can walk into the college football playoffs right now.
Yes, but they have to stay undefeated at this point.
And this week they have another undefeated test in NC State. Do you think that a dominant performance in this game will kind of have voters looking at Clemson like a real competitor towards these other four top teams?
Yes, perhaps, but I don't think it necessarily has to even be a dominant performance. I just think you have to win no matter what, because all of a sudden a potential one-loss Clemson team now has to compete with some one-loss Big 12 teams for that playoff spot, and that's going to be really hard. I think if they blow NC State out of the water, then they've really solidified their place in the playoff, even though a couple of us didn't quite have them up there just because of their schedule.
Yeah, I didn't at all. Another game, LSU, who bounced back from a loss in the previous week, goes up to Mississippi State. And for LSU, what do you have to do to keep your name in that SEC conversation up until you go up against Alabama?
I mean, you obviously have to keep winning, right? And this is going to be, I think, answer for us whether or not LSU needs to really be taken seriously, because they lost to Florida and then pummel Georgia, one of the top teams in the country, or so we thought. So even though Mississippi State doesn't quite have the same ranking that Georgia did, how they perform this weekend is really going to tell us what kind of team LSU is and whether or not they stand a real chance of upsetting Alabama at some point. They need to win this SEC game and win it by a lot, and then maybe the Florida loss was just a fluke.
All right, Big Ten matchup this week, Michigan, Michigan State. Both teams had big wins, but can either of these teams really compete with Ohio State and try to dethrone them as Big Ten champions?
I think that question, we'll get that answer probably this weekend. I think the answer is either both teams can compete with Ohio State or neither team can compete with Ohio State, right? A few weeks ago, Michigan almost lost to Northwestern. That wasn't great. And then they come out this week and play lights out on national television against Wisconsin. Michigan State did lose to Northwestern a couple weeks ago, and then they came out and beat Penn State. And Penn State, if you'll recall, was hanging with Ohio State really close. And they, in my opinion, they lost the game for themselves. Ohio State didn't necessarily beat them. So like the Big Ten tends to do at this point in the year, especially the Big Ten East, they're just making a mess of it.
Yeah.
So I think how Michigan and Michigan State match up this weekend and how both of them handle Ohio State will obviously then kind of give us, hopefully, a picture, unless it's just a roundabout circle again and we just have no real idea of who's the best. But if Michigan comes out on top, they're putting themselves in a good position to take control of the Big Ten should they beat Ohio State. Michigan State at this point is probably just looking to ruin as many people's days as possible, and they can do that by beating Michigan this weekend and then Ohio State down the road.
Last up, we have Oregon at Washington State, and can Justin Herbert keep his team in that Pac-12 championship race with the win?
I mean, absolutely. He's having a great game, a great season. He had a great game last weekend against Washington. And he's only a junior, but should he be looking toward the NFL draft, it seems like every week he just keeps improving his stock, and he's really, really impressive at this point. So a win like this over Washington State would be a big deal, especially if he's the one leading the way. But also, game day's going to Pullman, Washington for the first time ever.
Okay.
Washington State's flag, you'll always notice in the background of College Game Day. If you're looking for it, it's impossible to miss. Their flag has been there at Game Day for more than 200 games, and Game Day's never come to Washington State. That's about to change on Saturday, so that should be fun.
All right, well, we can't wait to see Washington State fly their flag at home with College Game Day there. For Michelle Martinelli, I'm Evan Thorpe. This was For the Wins College Football Breakdown. Thank you guys for watching.